Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with the Rational Independent. Today, we're taking a break from more serious news to talk about a little snitfit in the House. So, as you may know, Marjorie Taylor Greene is grown to be somewhat famous or infamous in the House as far as someone who's willing to be a little more of a firebrand, willing to speak her mind a little bit more, and even from time to time to break decorum. Decorum is an important principle that keeps divisive bodies, such as the House of Representatives, from descending into chaos. Decorum is what protects us from one of the more famous breaches of decorum was right before the Civil War, when a senator from the North was speaking on slavery, and a senator from the South took his cane, walked down to the well, nearly beat the other senator to death. He didn't die, but he broke his cane over his body and carried with it a threat that if you continue to disagree with us, this is what we'll do to you. He was never punished for that, by the way. So decorum is important, and Marjorie Taylor Greene has multiple times broken decorum of her own, speaking up in times when she's not permitted to speak. It may feel good in the moment, it may make for a nice little press blurb or a little mention on social media, but it violates decorum. And as with all principles, if you don't hold it, you can't expect the other side to hold it either. And that's what kind of started today's kerfuffle. From the Hill, Democrats erupt in laughter after Greene calls for decorum in the House. So Marjorie Taylor Greene was overseeing a conversation in the House. I forget all of the fancy names, but basically she was the one charged on calling people to speak, keeping the House in order, keeping everything moving through as it's expected. And Steve Scalise was speaking, and he was mocked. He was heckled. I believe a Democratic representative stood up and started shouting, interrupted the speech. Marjorie Taylor Greene called for decorum, and the Democrats laughed her to scorn for her call to decorum and proceeded to stand on their chairs and shout and yell and generally abandon decorum. This is a natural result of your choice to abandon a principle. I actually like Marjorie Taylor Greene as a person. I think she's a breath of fresh air, and I like what she's doing generally in Congress. That being said, you cannot violate decorum and then call for decorum. That's just simple truth. So she undermined her own leadership ability. It is what it is. However, it's also important to note briefly what they were kibitzing about. Namely, I'm going to go ahead and quote Steve Scalise while speaking of the upcoming debt limit issue. While some in this town might be interested in theatrics, House Republicans took action. We passed a bill to address the problem. It's time for my friends on the other side to start doing their job. Call the Senate back in to take up the bill. If they don't like it, they can amend it. That is part of the legislative process. Let's get our jobs done. We've done ours. They need to do theirs. So let's talk briefly about the debt limit situation. There's a piece of legislation in place that limits Congress from authorizing spending over a certain amount. You could call it something like a credit card limit. They have a limit to how much debt they can take out. The federal government runs on a deficit, which means that the debt it carries continues to grow over time. It's spending more than it takes in. The Democrats, and frankly, the Republicans when they're in charge, just look at Trump's spending. Both parties, when they're in charge, seem perfectly willing to run up the credit card. And then when they're out of power, to point fingers at the other side and say, look at those irresponsible spenders. Aren't they terrible people? This is similar to the principle with Marjorie Taylor Greene. If you won't hold to the principle when you're in charge, you can't be taken seriously when you're not in charge. President Biden and the Democrats have decided to put a line in the sand and say they are willing to default if they don't get what's called a clean debt limit increase, which means we get more money to spend with no restrictions and no concessions. The Republicans in Congress, in the House of Representatives, are at least attempting a degree of fiscal sanity. They're at least attempting to restrict spending and curtail this runaway train. It's not going to work, but they're at least trying. And so far, it's been a non-starter. They passed a bill that curtails a bit of spending and authorizes an increase in the debt limit. And the Democrats won't touch it. The Senate actually, I think, went into recess even. Now, we're about 6 or 7 days away from hitting that limit. And of course, there's descriptions about how that means the US will default, that means the world will shut down and everything's on fire, blah, blah, blah. We've never actually pushed that boundary very much, but probably worth discussing. It's not exactly as it's being presented. First off, there's huge chunks of the budget that are considered mandatory spending, not discretionary spending. And the debt limit only affects discretionary spending. So things like paying the military, things like Social Security, things like Medicare. These are all things that are in the mandatory spending bucket, which means the debt limit doesn't affect them. They'll continue to disperse as normal. Things like national parks, I think even maybe the Postal Service, I'm not sure. The point is, there's chunks of the government that will suspend operations. The powers that be are playing a high-stakes game of chicken, and the power of the purse resides with the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is held by the Republicans. So I applaud them for their efforts to hold the purse strings. Frankly, I'd be a little more disruptive. I don't think they're asking for enough. I think they should push much harder. I'm of the opinion that we would do well to start dismantling whole chunks of the federal government. The Department of Commerce, the Department of Education, Department of Energy. See you later. Even the Department of Transportation, you could make an argument for. But if we start carving big chunks out of what the federal government lays out, who knows? We might actually be able to run a surplus for a little while. Politicians aren't big on surpluses. They're kind of like drunken sailors because they're spending someone else's money. It's very easy for them to decide to spend your money in order to gain favors and power for themselves. That's the dynamic. That's what we're dealing with. That's why the cynic in me says we'll never see a change. That's today's Reddit rant. Good luck out there.